Good morning, everybody. Distinguished speaker, Dr. Rajiv, Special Advisor to the Provost on Open Education and Psychology Instructor at Queensland Polytechnics University in British Columbia, Vice Chancellor, Professor Anbahan Arudura, professors, deans, directors, fellow academic colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the OUSL, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Rajiv, for accepting our invitation. Also, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the 5th lecture of the 4th Distinguished Lecture Series, organized by the IRU in collaboration with the Center for Educational Technology and Media and IT Department of the Open University of Sri Lanka. The OUSL Distinguished Lecture Series is designed to foster rich academics discourse among local and international academics. Further, it intends to build capacities among Sri Lankan academics in good academic practices, technology-assisted teaching, sound research methodologies, and high-impact publications. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rajiv. And Dr. Rajiv is the Special Advisor to the Provost on Open Education and Psychological Instructor at Queensland Polytechnic University in British Columbia, where he conducts research on open education and the scholarship of teaching and learning. Dr. Rajiv serves as the co-director of the Open Pedagogy Notebook, an associate editor of psychological learning and teaching, and an ambassador for the Center for Open Science. He also currently serves as an advisory board of NOBA Psychology and Virtual Connecting. He is also a former senior open education research and advocacy fellow at the British Columbia campus and faculty workshop facilitator with the Open Textbook Network. Dr. Rajiv's books includes a compendium of scales of use in scholarship or teaching and learning, and the philosophy and practices that are revolutionize education and science. With this short introduction, I would like to call Dr. Rajiv to deliver his lecture.
Hello everyone. I have to say it's a real treat to be here. I've been following the work of colleagues of yours at the Open University of Sri Lanka for several years. And I think when you work within a university like this that serves such a large region, sometimes you focus very much internally and you don't quite realize the reputation and impact your work is having across the world. So please know that the work that is taking place over here is watched, is admired, it is respected in British Columbia where I work as well. Queensland Polytechnic University is a public post-secondary institution. We are in British Columbia. We serve about 25,000 students, mainly face-to-face, but we are an open access institution. So our mandate is to serve our region, it's to promote teaching excellence, and it's very much in that spirit that we lead Canada in open education. Among the things that we do that relate to open education is we support the creation, adaptation, and adoption of open textbooks and other open educational resources. A lot of our faculty embrace a approach to teaching and learning known as open pedagogy, which I will talk a little bit about during this lecture. And as well, we do a fair bit of research on open education as well. Over the last year, we have launched 2 degree programs at our university where students don't have to incur any textbook costs at all the way until they earn their credential by using OER, for example, open educational resources. So as I'm talking about open education, I think a good way to start would be to maybe define what we mean. And I think open education for many of us it's really a philosophy. It's a philosophy and an idea about how people should produce, share, and build on knowledge. And proponents of open education, certainly we believe that everyone everywhere should have equal access to high quality educational experiences and resources. And we work together collaboratively to try to remove barriers to achieve those goals. In some cases, those barriers are high costs, monetary costs, or opportunity costs. In other cases, it's outdated or obsolete materials. And still others, it's legal mechanisms that prevent or inhibit sharing and collaboration among scholars, especially in the region of intellectual property. Now, it's interesting to talk about open education right now, and especially in the context of equal access to education, because we are almost at the 70th anniversary. December 10th of 2018 will be the 70th anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a very important document for the world, of course. And in that document, there is Article 26. It says many things, but it starts with a basic principle, which in many ways is a foundation for open education, that everyone has the right to education. But I think one of the troubles with this is this still sounds like a radical idea, open education. And I think it's only radical because we have a very high tolerance for failure in delivering on this right. We're not delivering on this right now. So for example, we currently have 265 million children who are out of school. Article 26 goes on to say that education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. And still, we've got 57 million out-of-school children who are of primary school age. So again, we're failing, and we seem comfortable to be failing. Article 26 says that technical and professional education shall be made generally available. And yet we know, according to UNESCO's latest figures, that 617 million youth worldwide lack basic numeracy and literacy skills. And then finally, more relevant to our work daily, that higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. This is very difficult to deliver on. In North America, of course, there's a big burden of cost. And even in places like Sri Lanka, where there is not cost as a major barrier, there's certainly limits in how many seats are available and the competition to achieve those seats, and of course, to try and make equitable education access. Now, I work in North America, as I said, and over there, one of the biggest barriers to achieving higher education access is cost. Over the several last decades, we've seen that state and provincial ministries of advanced education have been withdrawing, decreasing the amount of funding for higher education. And as the funding decreases from the government, we've seen an increase in the cost of tuition fees, college fees for students. And it's reached a point right now where if you're wealthy as a student, you can access education, but unfortunately, most students are not wealthy. And so increasingly, we see that most of our students are working while they're going to school. They're looking for not just part-time jobs, but a growing number of them are looking for full-time jobs while they're going to school. But even if they're working a full-time job every single day of the week, every single week of the year, in many cases, that's still not enough to be able to pay their way to education, which is why most students at this point, a majority of students in both Canada and the United States, require a student loan to enter higher education. And this is where we start to see even greater problems. Student loans are quite crushing. The repayments are not very progressive, and so students often get trapped in this horrible cycle. Average student debt in North America at the moment, in both Canada and the United States, is about $30,000. That's just on average. So there's some programs like dentistry where it's far, far greater than that. And of course, with student loan debt, you've got interest that follows. Just using a casual reference for those of you who are Game of Thrones fans over here. But the reality is that this interest is what traps students. And as a psychologist, I will say I'm deeply concerned not just about the economic implications of the student loan debt, but the mental health implications. We have a growing generation of students who are saying we have to wait to get married until we pay off the debt. We have to wait to start a family until we pay off the debt. We have to wait to buy a home, to really start a life independently until we pay off the debt. So the burden is individual, but the impact is societal of this kind of debt. My alma mater, the school I went to as an undergraduate and a graduate student, is a wonderful research university called the University of British Columbia. And I loved my time there. But one thing that I definitely did not love was the high amount of tuition fees. And so a couple of years ago, well after I graduated, UBC decided that they would have a marketing campaign. It was around graduation, all the students were getting their degrees, the parents were on campus, and they put these posters on the ground around the campus. And they gave students markers, these felt pens, and they said, write in the blank what your most memorable experience is of being a student at UBC. This is not exactly what they were hoping students would write. One student wrote, I will always remember UBC for my crippling debt. But this is the reality. And one of the ways in which we see this is through the growing problem of food insecurity on college campuses. UBC, once again, like many institutions in North America, now have a food pantry, which is a place on each campus where students who are hungry, who do not have money to buy food, can go to get emergency rations. And over the last 2 years, the amount of food that students have been using from these pantries has been increasing, typically at the rate of about 100% every year. This is sad and difficult because I think for many faculty members, we're aware of these issues, but we have little control over them. We can't control the cost of tuition that the Board of Governors, that the government sets. At least individually, we can't control that. We can't control the cost of living in a place like Vancouver, which is very expensive. We can't control the cost of transportation. But there's one thing we can control. And this is why the open education movement in North America has focused very much on textbooks. Because textbooks are a faculty choice. Individual faculty get to choose what textbooks they assign to their students. And so we can control that. Unfortunately, most faculty don't realize that the cost of textbooks, commercial textbooks in North America, has gone up more than any other good in any sector. It's gone up by more than 1,000% since 1977, over 200% over the last 10 years, and always been between over 3 times the rate of inflation. Unfortunately, because faculty members don't have to pay for the books they assign, about 35% of faculty don't even know the cost of the books that they're asking their students to buy. And for the economists out there, you'll recognize this is an example of what's called a principal-agent problem. When one person makes a choice that other people have to suffer the consequences of, it creates a bit of a gap. It's similar to when doctors, when physicians prescribe medication that are very expensive, for example. But this is the reality. And it's not just the price, which means that we are now living in the era of the $400 textbook. This is incredible, by the way. At my university, if you pay tuition for a single course, it's about $400. And students are being asked to pay similar amounts of money for textbooks as the course. The difference is students don't know what the cost of textbooks is until after they register for the course. So they can't prepare for it, they can't secure a loan for it. It's a horrible surprise. And that's why we're seeing numbers like this. This is research from the United States, but there are very similar numbers from Canada as well. This is a survey of more than 20,000 students from every single degree granting institution in the state of Florida. And they did this survey in 2012 and again in 2016, that about 2/3, 67% of students are saying that they are not buying at least some of their required textbooks because of the cost. That about half of them are taking fewer courses at the same time because of the cost. They have to work many more hours to pay for those books. And of course, it goes worse. Some of them drop the course or even fail the course because of this. It's really very troubling. So it's not just the cost, it's the impact on educational outcomes. And I think when institutions start to see that it's not just affecting student success, it's affecting student retention, it's affecting program completion rates, this starts to have a larger impact on the institution as a whole. So I'm talking about textbooks, but as I said, textbooks is one tangible thing we can address. But more broadly, we're talking about factors like decreasing funding for higher education, which is a global problem. We're seeing it in Europe, we're seeing it in Australia, we're seeing it in Canada. And so this is why I've been very happy to see that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals explicitly recognize SDG number 4, which is quality education, not just focusing on the importance of equitable quality education for all, but also they recognize the central role that quality education plays for all of the other Sustainable Development Goals. It's very difficult for a society to make progress on gender equality without education, or to make progress on responsible consumption without education, or on climate action without education, or inequality without education. So once again, if you look at these broad goals, these important goals for the future health of our world, education is really at the core of all of these sustainable development goals. So, open educational resources are certainly an important integral part of the open education movement, and they've been really reaping a lot of success in terms of progress towards the sustainable development goals. Many of you will be familiar with open educational resources, but for those of you who are not, we're talking about any teaching and learning resources that are published with an open license. This can be images, it can be videos, it can be interactive simulations, and of course it can be textbooks. And it's quite dramatic to see the impact of this work. Open educational resources come with permissions so that users can not just reuse the resources, but they can also adapt it. Adapting could be we're updating it to make the latest research incorporated, but it could be localizing it. One of the most important and interesting projects over here is with translations. In Senegal, for example, there's a project known as CSD, and Senegal is one of the largest markets for education in STEM, that's online and asynchronous, self-paced. And they've been focusing a lot on translating high-quality educational resources for science, technology, education, and mathematics into local languages in Senegal. But beyond localizing, open licensing also allows others to earn a livelihood. So there is a whole set of sort of economy that's developing around open educational resources. Companies that are developing services and products around OER to enable them to also make a living. And I think when we think about the power of open licensing that permits people to not just access education and localize educational resources, but also to make a living off this, it I think comes back to the broader goal of education, which is empowerment through sharing. One of the interesting ways in which this is happening now is not just within education, but within the GLAM sector. These are galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. A lot of these institutions have been taking a lead in openly licensing resources. This is the British, for example, Museum, the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, and in this particular case, the Rijksmuseum. All of these institutions are looking at their resources and thinking, let us openly license it. Instead of hoarding it and restricting how many people can benefit from these wonderful works, we're going to open it up to the public. And with the Rijksmuseum, what they've done is they've taken really high-resolution scans of masterpieces in art, like by Vincent van Gogh and Vermeer and other Dutch artists, and they've released them into the public domain. So right now, any of you can download a 3 gigabyte size file of Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait. It's entirely free. It's entirely in the public domain. And I'm sharing this as an example because if you've ever been interested in studying art history, you'll know that textbooks for art history are probably the most expensive because of all the copyright permissions involved. Very expensive. But now the study of art history is open. It's easier. It's accessible. One of the other interesting side bits is that even though the Rijksmuseum released this to make their work accessible, they saw an interesting and unexpected benefit. You see, they also have a business model where they sell print copies of some of these masterworks from the Rijksmuseum itself. And what they found is, as soon as they started releasing these images openly, so anyone can access it without paying now, suddenly more people could see them and more people wanted to buy prints. So the sale of print copies of these resources went up dramatically, creating an unexpected revenue stream. I think that's another illustration of sometimes we don't share because we're afraid. Oh, if we share our resources openly, nobody will come to our institution. No, it's the other way around. When people can sample what an education at the Open University looks like without tremendous cost, they're more likely to come into the institution. And that's what we're seeing at my institution as well. A lot of what inhibits sharing is fear, right? Even as educators, I will say as a psychologist, as an instructor, we have our own professional development processes. We have our evaluation processes. Occasionally, I will have colleagues come into my classroom to witness me teaching. That's part of my evaluation. And when I think about how I prepare for those classes, I know which classes, which dates my colleagues are coming. And truthfully, I prepare for those classes differently. It's not a representative class because I know how much is at stake. But what I'm afraid of is what's interesting. In some cases, I think we are afraid that it's imposter syndrome. Like, I will be found out, that they will realize I don't know as much as they think I know. That's a fear. In other cases, that's not the fear. In other cases, the fear is, I have something really special. how I teach, the techniques I use, the examples I give, and I don't want anybody else to steal it. This is all fears, legitimate fears, but it's fears that inhibit the potential of the work we're already doing. And I think that's interesting. I mentioned it's not just images that can be open educational resources, but also interactive simulations. This is a wonderful project out of the University of Colorado at Boulder, where they've created very high quality interactive simulations for lots of different STEM disciplines. These are completely openly licensed. So they can be used, translated, localized, downloaded, embedded into your learning management system because they help students to understand the concepts. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. You should take advantage of these resources. They are open. They make your teaching more efficient, and certainly students will benefit. And of course, I've mentioned a couple of times already that open textbooks are a really important part of open educational resources, especially in places like North America, where there's such a heavy reliance on textbooks, and the textbooks themselves are so expensive that students are trying to go through the courses without buying it. So if you can give your students immediate first-day access to the resources, fantastic. It's also permanent access, because even after the students graduate from your university, they will always have access to these resources. One of the things we find is when students buy textbooks, commercial textbooks, because they're so expensive, at the end of their course, they resell it to try and get back some of the money. But this is also a problem, because if you think about a student who takes a course in anatomy or physiology, maybe they want to go on to medical school. Ideally, that book they should keep as a reference for their medical training, but they don't keep it because they need to recover the money. So the ability to keep these resources permanently is also really powerful, of course, also for lifelong learning. And lifelong learning is, of course, is one of the terms that is in the mission statement of the OUSL as well. This is one of the books that I've worked on. So I've worked on 3 different open textbooks at this point: Research Methods in Psychology, Social Psychology, Introductory Psychology. And I feel almost a little bit guilty when I talk to colleagues about open education, because psychology is abundant when it comes to open educational resources. It is such a popular discipline that the major funding agencies that have created open educational resources, they see that there's a big return on investment because so many students want to take these courses, so many students will benefit. So we're lucky. But what you can see over here is that my students have free access, not just on the internet, but they can download it in many different digital formats. So if they want to read it on their phone, on a Kindle e-reader, on a PDF document, even if they want to print it, they can do that. And it's just the cost of printing. But it's not just in North America. This is a project from South Africa, an open textbook project called Siyavula. And between 2012 and 2014, for example, the government of South Africa distributed 10 million open textbooks from this project to government schools. Now, of course, this is all over the world. And I mentioned earlier that we've been following and really admiring the work of your colleagues at the OUSL. This is one of 2 books that I've been reading that profiles case studies of how OER are being embedded into the teacher education training program over here at the OUSL. One of the great instruments that's been developed to measure the impact of the adoption of open educational practices was also here. But beyond OUSL, projects have been launched to support the creation and use of open educational resources across the global south, including in places like India, Afghanistan, Colombia, Mauritius, Tanzania, Uganda. So this is a global movement. The United Kingdom has launched an open textbook program. Australia, 2 weeks ago, launched a national network for open textbooks as well. And one of the nice things about this is when the government of New York State just supported open textbooks by investing $8 million, all the rest of us benefit because these resources are things we could use. When the government of British Columbia just invested, we don't have New York money, $250,000, still a lot of money. Everyone benefits as we're producing these resources. Right? This is also in Northern Europe. In Norway, for example, we've got the Norwegian Digital Learning Arena. It now has more than 100,000 open educational resource objects. These are used a lot. Every day there's more than 60,000 users who access these resources across the world. There's a project from Rice University in Houston in the United States where they've been developing very high quality open textbooks for the high enrollment courses. So you think introduction to physics, to chemistry, to biology, to psychology, sociology, all of these. They've got 25 of them, very high quality. And these books have now been adopted at about 50% of all universities in the United States. So this is very much a global movement. And I mentioned before that at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, my university, we're doing quite a bit of work with open education, not just adopting, but very actively supporting the adaptation and creation of these resources. I've had faculty over the last 2 years who've created, for example, in one case, an open textbook to learn how to, for students who are taking introductory courses in Punjabi, to open textbooks and how to help students to learn online. Courses, textbooks in communications, in organizational behavior, in ancient and medieval history. We're constantly publishing these resources. And a lot of these resources end up in the BC Campus repository I showed you earlier. So they're free for anyone to reuse, to adapt, and to localize. One of the nice things about open educational resources and open textbooks is it's not one of these things where it's a nice idea, you feel good, students are saving money, but it's not actually effective. Because I think there's a lot of things we could do to save students money that would not be helpful. We could turn off the, well, in Canada, I would say turn off the heat in the classrooms. Over here, I would say turn off the air conditioning in the whole university. You will save money, but it's not going to help people to perform well, right? You could do lots of things to save money, but you want to do things that, yes, have a financial benefit, but also help learning. And that's what we found. There's been about 25 studies published so far in the peer-reviewed literature that have looked at the impact on educational outcomes of open textbook adoption. Typically, you take students who are taking the same course. You randomly assign some of them to use the commercial textbook, some of them to use the open textbook. You look at the impact on their grades, on their marks, on things like how many of them are dropping out of the course, how many of them are completing the course. And what we're finding is it doesn't matter where the studies have taken place, what discipline, what type of institution, even what country. Most students who use open textbooks instead of commercial textbooks perform the same. But those who perform differently, they're actually performing better. And it's crazy to think about a student who is using a free and open resources performing better than students who are spending money on expensive commercial resources. And that's partly because of the question of access. Right? We can guarantee that all of the students have access to these resources where they wouldn't have before. There's a wonderful research group based in Utah at Brigham Young University, which has been doing a lot of work. Every time there's a new study that's published in this topic, they summarize it, they add it to this website. So if you're interested in knowing what is the latest research on this subject, you can go to one place and you'll actually find the open access copies of the articles as well if you actually want to read the research. But it's very, very compelling. But just like I said at the start, when students make negative choices for their education based on the cost of textbooks, I said those choices are more likely to be made by students who are already marginalized, who are first in their family to attend university, who are holding a student loan. So the students who can least afford it are suffering the most from high textbook costs. And what the research shows us is that the benefits of open textbooks, of open educational resources, are going to those students the most, which is a very good thing. It's a way of going to equity, right? And talking about equity, I'm highlighting over here the mission statement of the OUSL, which talks about the importance of enhancing access. Access, of course, is a critical core value of the open education movement. We want to ensure access, but also equitable access. And then, of course, you talk about high quality. High quality, well, one of the ways in which you can get a very high quality resource is that you can localize it. You can make it fit your program. You don't have to change your program to fit a textbook. You change the textbook to fit your program. You localize it. You do research, and you look at the research, you can see the impact on student outcomes. There's quality once again. Affordable, of course, it's more than affordable because OER are free in digital formats. But of course, they're also available in print format. Even at my institution, one of the things we do is we provide print copies of all of the open textbooks for all of the students who want it. That's important because we cannot assume that just because copying something digitally is basically free at this point, once you've got the first thing, you can copy it for no cost, it doesn't mean that it solves all your problems. Because then you have to assume that your students have access to expensive mobile technology devices. And if you don't think about that carefully, you can again make the problem worse. So having print copies of open educational resources are really important for us as well. But the difference is, with a typical commercial textbook, about 79% of the cost goes back to the commercial publisher. So now, from our university bookstore, we can sell print copies of open textbooks that would normally cost $100 for $19 or $20 or so. Much more affordable. But print is really important. So of course you go on, open distance education and ensure lifelong learning opportunities to face challenges in a knowledge society. And again, this goes back to the permissions. With OER, you're able to retain the resources forever. There's the lifelong learning. You're able to redistribute these resources freely. So it's not just formal learning, but informal learning. Right? Students can share it with their families, with their communities. Open education supports your mission. But open education is also more about than just resources. And resources, of course, have those 5 permissions I've been talking about, which are known as the 5 R's, to reuse, revise, remix, retain, and redistribute resources. But it also includes open educational practices, which is how can you inform, how can you change your teaching in a way that is influenced by open? Because many of us say, well, let's take advantage of the permissions to revise and remix. But let's not just ensure that people have equal access to knowledge, but also equal access to knowledge creation. Now, I'm talking about something that's known as open pedagogy, your approach to teaching and learning that's influenced by open and open licensing. But it's a difficult concept to grasp unless you're comparing it against something else. So first, I'm going to give you something to compare it against, what is a very, very traditional approach to teaching and learning. And this is a really interesting image. I find this image actually quite hilarious. This is an illustration from a French book that was published about 100 years ago. And the book depicted various scenarios from the future. Right? What would travel look like? What would shopping look like? And what would education look like? So this illustration depicts what they say the classroom of the year 2000. And of course, this was about 100 years ago, so the classroom of the future for them. And it's always interesting to me, when you're dealing with technology, you have to look at the platform and what is the ideology that's within that platform. And the same thing is true for illustrations. Because 100 years ago in France, clearly they thought only older, white, male professors were possible. No female professors, surely. Only boys are allowed in the classroom. This is very interesting. It's very evident what the ideology was, what the politics were, who was permitted to access education. But also the approach to teaching and learning. Because there's no active learning, there's no experiential learning, there's no peer interaction, they're not even taking notes. There's just this electronic system where they're magically delivering the information. At many institutions, of course, a lot of the hard work of teaching and learning is done, especially by graduate students who work as teaching assistants. And I think you're seeing a depiction of what I would look at as a graduate student actually cranking the lever. But this is fascinating because I think it's also not very different from how higher education is practiced today. So we can look at this and we can criticize this and laugh at this, but it's still the case that the majority of students are learning like this. And this is what the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire described as the banking model of education. And this is where this banking model turns students into containers to be filled by the teacher, right? You're filling a vessel effectively. The more completely the teacher fills the receptacles, the better a teacher she is. And think about that in terms of how teachers are evaluated. But the more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. What is the culture of the student? Is it that when they're obedient and quiet in the classroom that they get better marks? Is that what we really want? Education thus becomes the act of depositing, in which students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. And in this banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift that's bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. And that last statement, I think, is especially telling, because those are part of the assumptions we make. I develop my curriculum, I will lay out the plan, assuming my students know nothing. But if that's my approach, I'm also really depriving myself and I'm depriving my students of all of the knowledge they've already come in with. They know a lot. They have a lot of life experience, whether it's informal learning or formal learning. And if we don't take advantage of that, we're really impoverishing, I think, the experience in the classroom. But this is the banking model of education. And the banking model is really different from open pedagogy. Because with open pedagogy, we're very interested in giving students what we call more agency, more autonomy, more control in the classroom. And as a thought experiment, I'll get you to think about what would it look like if we created the structure of the course in partnership with the students. It sounds like a crazy radical concept. I completely understand that. But just as a thought experiment, let's suspend the disbelief for 1 minute and imagine what this would look like. Because of accreditation, program requirements, and other things, we will prescribe already what the learning outcomes are for a specific course. And maybe if you have assistance with instructional design, as your institution fortunately does, you will think about aligning your activities and your assessments with those outcomes. That's fantastic. But is it not a little strange that we can tell our students, this is what the journey will look like over the course, and I can tell you the whole nature of the journey before I've ever met any of you? That's strange. For me, I would love to find a way to work with my students to know what are their career goals, what are their backgrounds, how can their backgrounds influence the journey and benefit other students in the class, how can we shape the journey in a way that helps them. If I know one of my students is really interested in going into marketing, I can bring in examples and demonstrations that are specific to that. I want to shape the journey so it's relevant to them. And when it's relevant to them, they react. They see the relevance, they are less bored, they're not just staring at their cellular phones in the class. They're with me because the journey is for them. It's not that they have to modify themselves for the journey. But beyond the structure of the course, you can also look at technical elements. One of the nice things, the parallels between our universities is we both use the same learning management system, Moodle. And I know as an instructor, I load my resources into it. I put the open textbook inside the Moodle shell so students can access it. But discussion forums, quizzes, other things like that. And at the end of the semester, Moodle gives us the ability to archive, to save the shell of the course. Maybe we're going to teach that course again in the future, so I want to reuse some of those resources. But the one thing I think most of us do, as we're saving the shell of the course, we don't save any of the student discussion comments. We don't save any of the resources or assignments that the students have done. We think, oh no, that's just for their learning and that's it. And that's why I think there's an interesting possibility. Because a lot of student assignments are disposable. And I'm saying disposable in the sense of, yes, it serves a purpose. It helps them to develop specific skills, writing skills, communication skills, even content mastery in specific areas. But beyond that, they have a lot of energy, a lot of potential, a lot of creativity. And if we're telling them at the beginning of the course, here are the learning outcomes, I can tell you what that is without meeting you because you're not going to affect the journey. At the end of the course, we're saying, you did all this work, but I'm deleting it because it's not useful to anybody else. Those are strong messages we're sending students. And then with assignments, what if we flip it? And so that students are doing something more. We can develop the same skills as a student would develop writing a research essay by having them do something else, like edit Wikipedia. And this, I'm starting purposely in a very controversial space because no matter where I go in the world, Wikipedia in university is a bad word. Sometimes it's very explicitly, it's like the 11th commandment or something, thou shalt not cite Wikipedia. It's a guideline in the course assignments. And I understand that, right? Because it's unreliable, and as academics, it's not what we consider peer-reviewed literature. We feel we can't trust it, and you can't trust it. In my discipline, for example, in psychology, there's about 9,000 articles in Wikipedia. About 2/3 of them have been peer-reviewed by Wikipedia's standards, which are not my standards. And about 10% of those articles are considered good articles by Wikipedia, not by me. So yes, there's issues. This is one of my favorite examples as well. Because anyone can edit it, sometimes strange things happen. January 2012, if you read about the first law of thermodynamics, you'd read that the first law of thermodynamics is that you do not talk about thermodynamics. So for those of you who know the movie Fight Club, this is a very famous line, and clearly whoever edited this article was a big fan of that movie. But this is nonsense, of course. And you see this especially in political arenas where people deliberately try to sabotage articles and various topics. But we know at the same time that Wikipedia is the first place that the public goes for information. We know it's the first place, whether we like it or not, that our students go for information. And if we're really honest, it's very often the first place that we go for information. Google itself has integrated Wikipedia so that when you search for a concept, the first thing that comes up typically is a Wikipedia entry. So knowing all of this, I think as educators, in higher education especially, I think we are abdicating our responsibility. We want to train our students to have research skills, yes, to have writing skills, yes. They can do this by editing Wikipedia. Many instructors are doing this. I'm showing you the case of Amin Azam, who's a faculty member at the University of California Medical School. He works with his medical students to improve articles for a variety of medical topics in Wikipedia. The primary goal of this work is training for the students who do have to learn how to explain complex medical concepts in simple terms to a lay audience when they walk into their clinic. But the secondary goal, which is a huge benefit, is improving a public resource. And the Wiki Education Foundation is an amazing organization. They have resources for anyone who's interested in doing this. If you've never done, as a faculty member, designed a Wikipedia assignment for your students, I'll tell you it's not frightening. They have step-by-step guides ready for faculty. They have step-by-step guides ready for students. They have grading rubrics that are available for you to evaluate your students' work. They have a campus Wikipedia ambassador program. They do a lot. And there's a lot of people who've already done this kind of work. But if you're not interested in Wikipedia, you could look at another element of your course. Perhaps instead of asking your students to give an oral presentation in the class in front of 40 students, maybe you could ask them to create a small instructional video. That's what some faculty members are doing. In this particular case, these are two students at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia who were tasked by the faculty member to create a video about persuasion, a particular theory behind persuasion in psychology. And they submitted their video, which is openly licensed on YouTube, to an international student video competition. They won an incredible amount of money. I mean, that's a ridiculous amount of money even in the Canadian context. But more important than the monetary prize and the recognition is the fact that this video, it's so good, it's simple, but it's a great explanation. That faculty members across the world right now are using these students' video to teach the science of persuasion. And try to imagine for a moment what it would feel like. If you were the student who created this video, how would that make you feel? When you go to a potential employer, you can show them. It's like an electronic portfolio of your academic work, and you made a difference. Your work is good enough for this. These are the skills you're bringing. It could be writing skills. Most of our students don't go on to graduate school in the discipline that they're studying undergraduate courses in. But I think our training is geared towards a very traditional approach, where if they're taking a course in psychology, I want them to learn how to do research and write research articles and journal articles in psychology. But the truth is, they need to learn how to write more than they need to learn how to write a journal article. And to write clearly in an engaging way that's evidence-based. Instead of a journal article, instead of a research essay, I can ask them to write what we call an op-ed piece. In some cases, this is called a letter to the editor. So you pick a problem that's affecting your community. Maybe a political problem, perhaps. And you get your students to write a brief 500 to 750 word letter. It's evidence-based, it's engaging, it's clear. They submit it for publication to a local newspaper. They're sharing their growing knowledge with their community. They could end up with a publication, but these are skills that they could really use, that the wider world will also benefit from. And of course, there's a whole range of open pedagogies like this, which revolve around open textbooks as well. So what you're seeing over here in the center is text from one of the open textbooks I use in my classes for social psychology. But on the right, you're seeing my students using a digital tool that's free and open source once again to annotate the book. They're making comments in the margins of the book in a way that will be, those comments are learning and teaching learning resources for future students who will use the same book. On the top, you're seeing a student share a personal example that gives another explanation of the same concept that's already explained in the text. It's a second example, and it's helpful for future students who don't understand the example that's just in the text. And on the bottom, it's not just a personal example, but it's an external resource. I think one of the things I'm always amused by is many of our faculty members, we went to school much before our students did. And one of the things my colleagues often struggle with is, I need to come up with a good example that my students can relate to. So then we'll look at popular culture. What is the latest movie or TV show? And there's a small video clip that shows this concept. But it's very difficult for faculty to, what are students aware of these days? What shows do they watch? You don't have to be on top of these things. The students are the best position to do this. So as a small bonus credit assignment, I get my students to share external resources that illustrate these concepts. That helps other students. It actually reduces my workload at the same time. But it's a very rich teaching and learning resource. And of course, students can do more than just annotate open textbooks. They can also author open textbooks. This is a really interesting example of one where students, I think these are second-year undergraduate students at The Ohio State University in the United States, have been writing small, bite-sized research essays on environmental science, different elements of it. The editors of this book are the faculty in the program. So there's obviously peer review, then there's faculty review and all of that. There's quality control. But ultimately, the student work is not just going into a recycling bin, never to be seen by anybody else. They are developing what is now a textbook for anyone interested in learning about different elements of environmental science, which again touches on the UN Sustainable Development Goal of climate action, for example. So all of this is possible. And there are so many faculty members across the world who are now experimenting with moving away from this banking model of education to give students a lot more control, a lot more agency, where they can see the meaning and purpose of their work, that it's having an impact beyond the people in their class, and often involving creating an openly licensed resource at the same time. So I invite you to browse this website. We call it the Open Pedagogy Notebook. It's just openpedagogy.org. And you can browse through examples from a wide range of disciplines. There are examples in there from people who are teaching electrical trades, for example, and how they're involving their students over there. And of course, from biology and psychology and lots of other disciplines, nursing as well. But as much as I've been talking about open education and open pedagogy, I do also want to make the connection to broader elements of open scholarship. And that very much includes open science. So I think with open science, it's useful to maybe think about what science looks like, or maybe what it really should look like. Those of you who are familiar with the scientific method, you'll know we start by making observations about the world. Maybe you notice something interesting, something curious, something that catches your attention. Based on your observations, maybe you'll generate a question. In some cases, you'll generate a specific prediction. I think this is what causes this, right? That's your prediction. Whether it's physics or psychology, it's the same approach. And then you design a study that's designed to test that hypothesis, to evaluate whether that question, whether that prediction is accurate or not. Then you collect the data and you check the data. You run some statistical analyses to see, was the prediction supported or not? And then, of course, you write it up as an article and you submit it to a scholarly journal for publication. Right? This is how the scientific process works. Other people read your work, they'll get more ideas for more research, for more hypotheses, and science proceeds. Except that this is a lie. This is not how science actually works. This is how science ought to work. In reality, a lot of people do research, sure, but there are incentives within the academy to only publish research in which your predictions were supported. If your predictions were not supported, many researchers, many scientists don't bother. They say, I'm not going to bother. Or sometimes, even if you bother writing it up and submitting it to a journal, the journal will reject it because they're not interested in publishing research that essentially has what we call a null result. But this is deeply problematic, and I want to illustrate one example of why. Again, I'm giving you an example from psychology. This is a researcher, and I'm using that term loosely, whose name is Diederik Stapel. He worked at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. He was a very famous researcher for quite a while because he kept coming up with these really interesting, counterintuitive, novel hypotheses. And that's an interesting illustration as well, because within many fields, the people who do the small, incremental research, answering the next step of the next question, the careful, hard work, often don't get all of the attention. The people who get the attention are the ones who pick the sort of flashy, exciting research that's groundbreaking, and nobody thought of that before. It's so innovative. And because of that, many people feel like, oh, that's the kind of research I need to do. He was doing that kind of research. This is one of the papers he published. And I'm showing you this one because he published it in Science, which is one of the most difficult journals to publish in, one of the most prestigious journals in the world. Science, Nature, these are really the top journals. His hypothesis in this particular paper was that when people are in an environment, in a room, in a space which is littered, which has trash on the ground, they are more likely to think in terms of stereotypes and apply stereotypes to groups of people. You think, That's not a natural, like how does that happen? He had a very interesting theory behind it. He thought that, stereotypes are essentially oversimplified but simplified views of people, simplified categories, oversimplified categories. And he said when people are in a space where it's chaotic, where it's uncertain, and even if it's just dirty, people have a greater need for stability. And he thought if you're physically in an environment that's messy, you're more likely to even think in terms of stereotypes. And he tried this. There was a garbage strike in the Netherlands, and he ran this study at different train stations. And sure enough, he found that when he gave people questionnaires, they were more likely to endorse stereotypes about different groups of people. And then they were clever even further, because they gave people the questionnaire, and they said, oh, yeah, go into the next room and fill out the questionnaire. There were 6 chairs in the room. 5 of them were empty, and at the very end, this was in the Netherlands, and so black people are a real minority in the Netherlands. There was a black person sitting at the chair at the very end. And he said it's not just that people were more likely to endorse stereotypes when they were in a messy room, but when they were in a messy room, they sat significantly further away from the black person. So it was, wow, this is really interesting. This is influencing behavior without people realizing it. Got published in Science. Problem is, he never actually did the study. He made it up. He fabricated the data, which is probably one of the worst things you could possibly do as a scholar. There's few things you could do that's worse than that. Invented the whole thing. And it came out later. The university found out because the graduate students never had access to the data. When people wanted to replicate his study, nobody could replicate it. We're saying we're trying the same method, we're using the same thing. Nobody's able to get the same effect. How is that possible? This is a problem. And so then eventually it came to light. He fabricated it all. And in the years since, there have been 58 journal articles published by this man that have all been retracted. None of it was true. Imagine the years that other researchers spent reading that work and saying, okay, I'm going to build on that hypothesis. I'm going to try and replicate that study. How many millions of dollars were wasted at other universities because of the fraudulent breadcrumbs that this man laid, essentially? It's horrifying for the field. And this is one of the reasons why my discipline, psychology, has been really focused in the last few years on revisiting many of the previous findings to see what can we trust. There are many studies in psychology that are looked at as classic studies, but we're testing them to make sure, can we really trust this now? And it turns out in this recent report, which was published just, less than 2 weeks ago, 28 classic and contemporary findings were tested across different universities, different contexts, and only half of them, 50%, were reliably able to be replicated. This is not good news for science, but I think it's more of an indictment of how science has been practiced. This is one of the reasons why there's such a shift towards open science practices, which I'll talk about. But as I said, data fabrication is about as serious an offense as you can commit as a researcher. But beyond that, there are smaller offenses that are very, very common. A lot of researchers will plan studies that even if there is a real effect to be found, even if it's a true effect, it would exist, they design a study in a way that's statistically underpowered. So the study is incapable of detecting the real effect, even if it exists. It's like having an X-ray machine that's not strong enough to actually penetrate the outer layer of your skin. It doesn't matter how many times you run the study, you're not going to be able to find it, even if there's something inside. That's that problem. Another problem, which is known as p-hacking, is where people cheat. Normally you collect the data, then you analyze the data. But you get people now, very often, who are analyzing the data every day that they're collecting the data. They're checking to see, is it significant? No, not yet. Let me collect from 2 more participants. Is it significant now? No. Let me get from 2 more participants. Is it significant now? Yes, it's significant. I'm going to stop collecting data now. I'm going to write my article. This is p-hacking. This is not how science works. Right? This is a very, very misleading way of performing science. Then you have harking, which stands for hypothesizing after the results are known. There's some research which is genuinely confirmatory research, which means you have a hypothesis, you predicted it, and you're testing it. But there's a lot of research that is exploratory research. It's a new area. You really have no way of guessing what's going to happen. And that's why you're studying it, because you don't know. But because there's such a heavy bias towards guessing correctly, people sometimes find a significant result just when they're exploring, and then they pretend that that significant result was a prediction they made in advance. They're hypothesizing, but after they know the results. That's harking, and that's also a misleading scientific practice. And then, of course, 2 related things. The file draw problem is when you do a study, you don't get a significant result, it's a null result. People say, I'm not going to bother publishing it, I'm going to put it in my file drawer and forget about it. Which means that if you look at the literature, you're hoping that you'll get a general sense, an accurate sense of what that research area looks like. But it's misleading, because if you're only looking at the studies that have been published, you're not seeing all of the studies that did not find a result, that were not published. It's misleading. And then, of course, the publication bias is when it's not just the researcher who chooses not to submit a null result study, but it's the journals that say, well, we're less likely to publish if it's a null result. These are all problems. This was an interesting study that was published a few years ago. And you don't really have to look at the details, but on the left, it's really listing a whole series of questionable research practices, like the ones I've been talking about, harking, p-hacking, and so on. Sometimes you collect data on 5 different variables. 1 of them was significant, 4 of them were not. Then people pretend like there were no other 4. Let's sweep that under the rug, put that in the file drawer. I'm going to write the study pretending there was only 1. And look, I was brilliant enough to guess in advance what would happen. This is an open secret. This is how science works now. It's not how it should work. And what you're seeing in the second column is the admission rate, the number of the proportion of about 4,000 researchers who completed an anonymous survey who said, yes, I've actually done that. In some cases, it's a majority of researchers. The third column tells you about the number of them who think it's a good idea. So they think it's indefensible, but many of them are doing it at the same time, because they know this is how the game works. And this is where the shift to open science practices happens. One of the critical open science practices is the badge on the right at the bottom for pre-registration. This is really important now. If you pre-register your hypothesis with a timestamp before you begin collecting data, the world knows, your discipline knows, the journal knows, your colleagues know, this was a hypothesis you made in advance. You're not just pre-registering a hypothesis, you're pre-registering your analysis plan. So then you can't do the, let me check the data, collect more people, check the data, collect more people. No, you specified how many participants would be in each condition in advance. You specified which hypotheses you were testing, which analyses you were going to run. So you can't just go on a fishing expedition. There's a clear difference between exploratory research and confirmatory research. But the other 2 badges also illustrate open science practices, because increasingly researchers are sharing not just the study, but the data, the raw data, putting it in an open repository so that other people can reproduce it, check your analyses. Also open materials. Again, in my field, we've been dealing with this reproducibility crisis where about half of the studies are not replicating. But if you want your work to be replicated, you need to share your research instruments, your survey questions, whatever you used, your procedure needs to be available for the rest of the discipline. Yes, there are fears people have, but these are the same fears that we deal with at open education. If you really are interested in education, it needs to be open. If you're really interested in science progressing, it needs to be open. And that's where this is going. But anything about open science also has to touch open access scholarship. And it always amuses me that the most brilliant people around the world, academics working at universities, have somehow decided to do the most absurd thing in this world. We apply to public funding to do research, right? The public pays for that research. We spend our time, our labor on that. Our salaries are also paid by the public as public institutions. Okay, so research granting, public work, public funding, our salaries, public funding. And then we do the research. And at the end of it, we write it up, we submit it for publication to a journal. And then, of course, it's difficult. Sometimes you have to revise and resubmit. You go through many, many rounds of this. It's exhausting. So by the time you finally get a notice of acceptance, congratulations, we've accepted your article for a journal, you're so excited that you quickly sign a document. And the document is you're signing over the intellectual property to a commercial publisher. We sign over this work. We're taking publicly funded research and then we're gifting it to for-profit companies around the world. It's incredible. But that's not enough. Because beyond the raw material of the research, we also then say, no, let me help you even more. Let me help your shareholders even more. And let me volunteer my time as a peer reviewer for your journal. Let me volunteer my time as an editor for your journal. And that's how this is the most profitable business in the world, is scholarly publishing. It's ridiculous. This is an oligopoly where you've got about 5 publishers that are publishing the lion's share of research in the entire planet. all of this research is publicly funded, but it's not accessible to the public. And the joke is, even if you've done all of this, which is silly enough, it's absurd enough, public funding research, public funding your salary, here's my intellectual property, here's my voluntary labor, here's my editorial work, your university has to then pay the publisher even more money to subscribe to the journal that you published in so that your colleague next door to you can read the article you published. It is ridiculous. If you ever explain scholarly publishing to a layperson who's not in academia, they would look at you like you're mad. And they would be right. We are mad. This is ridiculous. And we're at a breaking point with open access publishing. There are many countries that have simply had enough. Harvard University, one of the richest universities in this world, have said, we can't subscribe to these resources anymore. It's too expensive. If it's too expensive for Harvard, we have a problem. So Plan S, lots of other initiatives coming out that are really now coming even from the granting agency. In Canada, we have federal granting agencies that now mandate that if you're publicly funded research, within 12 months, your work has to be published in an open repository. It has to be. Otherwise, you're not getting public funding. And it makes sense. This is Aaron Swartz. He's a real hero of the open access scholarly publishing movement. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But he wrote what's known as the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto. And in it, he wrote that information is power. But like all power, there are those who want to keep it for themselves. The world's entire scientific and cultural heritage, published over centuries in books and journals, is increasingly being digitized and locked up by a handful of private companies. Those with access to these resources, students, librarians, scientists, in other words, you and me, we've been given a privilege. We get to feed at the banquet of this knowledge while the rest of the world is locked out. But we need not, indeed morally, we cannot keep this privilege for ourselves. We have a duty to share it with the world. And I think he's right. There's many examples of this. When the Ebola virus emerged, for example, one of the reasons why we were able to, or researchers were able to devise some vaccines for it, is because all of the researchers who were studying the Ebola virus were sharing their data openly in open repositories, so they could very quickly compare each other's work, aggregate the data, and advance. If they didn't do that, we wouldn't have made this kind of progress. So sometimes open data is very much a life and death issue. But even if you think selfishly, by all means, do that. Open access is still a good idea. Because if people search for your work in Google Scholar, and instead of a link to a paywall journal which they can't access, if they suddenly get the full text of your article, surprise, people can read what they can access. And if people read your work, they start to cite your work. And suddenly, your work is having an impact. Suddenly, your citation rates are going up. Now, these are things that influence tenure and promotion, even at traditional universities. So yes, publicly funded research should be accessible to the public. Yes, people should share data to make science move better. Yes, you could even do it selfishly to get a higher citation rate. But you're going to have an impact, and I think that's what we should really care about. There are still some areas, though, where there are no high-quality open access journals that don't have expensive article processing charges. Again, I have to say in my discipline, in psychology, we're lucky because there are real open access journals that do not charge article processing charges, that are high quality, that have well-known editorial boards, and that's my first place to publish. But in some cases, people really want to publish in a particular traditional journal that's paywalled. But even there, you can find a way to make it open. And that's by placing a preprint of your article in an open repository. Most traditional paywall journals permit the researchers to take a copy of their work, not the final typeset formatted version on the publisher's manuscript, but your copy. Like if you typed it up in Microsoft Word, save it as a PDF document, you can upload that, the final accepted version, in an open repository, so that people who don't work at institutions that are wealthy enough to subscribe to all of those databases can still access your work. The public can still access your work. You can still be open access, even if you're working with closed journals. Right? So this is all possible. It doesn't have to be either or. And so I've been talking about these three different movements at this point. Open education, and of course not just resources, but also open pedagogy, open science, of course, and then open access scholarly publishing. And I'm talking about these because these are three movements that have really been running parallel paths. all of them are trying to achieve equitable foundations for open knowledge. But if you think about it, if you think about what are the values that brought you into education in the first place, why are we working at institutions that, in my case, are open admissions, or in your case, is actually an open university, right? Open education is better. Why? Because it's more accessible. And if you think about open pedagogy, it's certainly more innovative. Open science is better. Why? Because it's more transparent, and of course, because it's more rigorous when it's open. Open access publishing is better. Again, because it's accessible to the public, but also once it's accessible, it has an impact. I'm not interested in communicating in the least accessible style through the least accessible channels. I want my work to have an impact. Right? So for example, when we talk about open education, if you put those values together, we're talking about access, we're talking about innovation, transparency, rigor, and impact. Those are values that I think we all hold. Those are goals I think we all hold in our work. And this is why openness supports this work. This is a book that I published last year, and it's an edited book. I worked on it with a colleague, Robert Biswas-Diener, and even though we wrote a couple of chapters in there, it's really an edited collection. It brought together chapters written by leading voices in the open education, open science, and open access movements. It's free to download, and I invite you. You don't have to spend anything. You can download it today, but because it's openly licensed, you can translate it. You can remix it. You can use it for teaching and learning by all means. But as I said again, I want to have impact. You know, the typical scholarly book, if an academic publishes a book, it sells maybe 80 copies worldwide. That's great. It's a line on your CV. You might get promoted or something. Who cares? You publish a peer-reviewed journal article, the average journal article is read by 10 people. Who cares? This book was published about a year and a half ago. It's already been downloaded 15,000 times. That's unusual. That's not special about me. That's special about open access. So again, I think the power of this is openness can serve as an accelerant. Whatever your goals are, if it's widening access, if it's pedagogical innovation, if it's social justice, if it's scientific rigor, if it's impactful scholarship, it serves as an accelerant. At the same time, of course, it is not to be applied uncritically. There are serious challenges with openness. There are important ways in which scholars need to be supported in the move to this space. Some of those supports need to come from institutions. Right now, institutions actively disincentivize shifts to openness when they say, we will only reward you for publishing in paywalled journals, or we will only recognize your work, for example, if you publish a book but not an open textbook. There are supports that are necessary. But the conversation has begun. And I think open universities like yours are really already extremely well placed to lead the charge, to lead the shift. You're already doing it in education. And I'd love to witness your shift in open science and open access publishing as well in the years to come. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you very much for your very interesting and very thoughtful presentation.
Thank you.
And also very relevant to our university, Open University of Sri Lanka, and also to the entire world actually. Now we will have a discussion, and any open discussion that you want to ask, you can ask. To start the flow, I just want to ask you one thing. You continuously mention about this open text.
Yeah.
Now the open text, and you mentioned that is in different format, PDF, in mobile access thing, and also in the text print. In your experience, that in students' points of view, which format they normally like and they prefer to be in that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I'll add one other detail while I'm answering this question as well, which is that it's one of the nice things is the open textbook movement has really been based on free and open source software at the same time. And the open textbooks that I showed during my presentation were all created using a platform that's based on WordPress, which is called Pressbooks. And when you author textbooks, which many programs are already doing, open textbook projects in Pressbooks, you can automatically export to all of the digital formats with just one click of the button and also set it up for print. Now, the flexibility of formats is really important because I think you cannot assume that students have one particular device or anything else. But I think this may differ region to region. In North America, you get a lot of people who use the phrase digital natives. And they assume that students today, because they're millennials, because they grew up with the internet in some ways, that they should all be comfortable with, digital textbooks. That's not the case. Not the case at all. Overwhelmingly, all of the research that we've been doing, that I've seen elsewhere in North America at least, shows that students overwhelmingly prefer print resources if they can afford it. If they're forced to choose between a very expensive print resource and a free digital resource, of course they'll go with the digital. But ideally they would want both. That's what we've seen. And I think with this notion of digital natives, I think it behooves us to understand there's a bit of a difference over here. If students are comfortable with technology, yes, they may be very comfortable using Snapchat. But even students using Snapchat with an iPhone may have no idea, no clue that a PDF document has a table of contents, that there's a search function. So I think there's a range of digital literacies that we need to build if we're going to help students to transition to a digital future. But for the moment, and especially unless we do that, print is what they prefer.
Okay, thank you very much for your. Now, the other question I have is about the open educational practice.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned that infinity.
Yes.
Now, we know that this open movement and open access, this particular practice and everything is in the university system, is certain extent is there. Mm-hmm. How it is going down to the level of the secondary education, and people are ready to do this particular practice in the that particular level, because that is very important when they come to the university. So the system will have some sort of a inbuilt system for the student to adapt it.
Absolutely. I mean, so there's a bit of variation around the world for sure. But in what we call K-12 education, for example, kindergarten to grade 12 or until high school, there's many countries in the world where there's a lot of open education resource use in K-12. Poland, for example, is a country that's done this. Brazil has recently done this. In the United States, they've launched a big project called Go Open. So there's about 40 different school districts across different states which are actively developing open educational resources. Now, that's partly because the argument for policymakers can be made two ways, right? If you have governments that are left-leaning, open education serves social justice. It serves equity, which is a language that they understand quite well. And it's easy for them to sell to their supporters. If you have a right-leaning government, a conservative government, it's also easy to talk about because it's highly fiscally efficient. You've got governments that are spending a lot of money to develop and buy copies of textbooks, which get out of date. But with open textbooks, you can update them with very low cost. You can distribute them very widely with low cost. You can ensure all students have access outside of school. So it's actually quite efficient. So we're seeing quite a lot of adoption. It's not as much as it is in higher education at the moment, system, but there's definitely, and it's emerging quite broadly.
That is important for the future as well.
Yes, absolutely. And there's dedicated projects emerging now for K-12. Where there's less work happening is that the two sectors are not yet talking to each other very well. And that's often because they're administered by very different ministries. Education is sometimes different from higher education, although maybe not currently in Sri Lanka.
But I think we have the movement into doing this particular open educational practice to the provincial level implementation. We had a workshop and we have a policy developed for that particular thing. In the blessing of Ministry of Education, that process is also going on in Sri Lanka. Yes.
Yeah, and I think one of the nice things as well, sometimes we look at this as a secondary benefit of open educational resources, especially K-12 or teacher education programs. But if you read some of those case studies in the books that have been published out of the OUSL press about Shironika's work with Som Naidu, you can see there are serious benefits to the educators.
Yes.
How excited they get, how reinvigorated their approach is to pedagogy, to teaching and learning. It's sort of freeing in a way, right? And this is where it's free plus freedom in terms of the pedagogy. So I think as we approach it, as we think about it, and it requires investment, I think it's worth highlighting that there are definitely massive benefits to students, but there are real benefits to educators at the same time.
Thank you very much for your thing. And any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question. It's general opinion that when it is OER or open textbook, it should be of free. It should be free of cost. I mean, it should not be priced.
Yes.
But when you were talking, you said if an open textbook is converted into a print format,
Yes.
then you are going to sell it for a small price.
Yes.
So still, if it is sold for a price, still do you call it an open textbook?
Yes. So it depends on the license. So first of all, with open licensing, of course, there's books that are more openly licensed and less openly licensed. So if you have a book that just has an attribution requirement and nothing else, you're basically saying you can use this, you just have to give credit to the creator, you can't pass it off as your own work, but beyond that you can do anything you want. So for institutions like mine, for example, we don't have very much money, we're not extremely wealthy or anything like that. So it costs us money to print those books. So the first thing we recover is the cost of printing. But beyond that, we can, if we want, with openly licensed books, just as there's a regular sort of profit margin added to a traditional commercial textbook, you could add the same profit margin to the open textbook. And that's partly because you've got personnel, you've got overhead of the bookstore and the people who are producing the printing. Maybe you want to recover that, maybe you don't want to. But certainly, if you get books that have a non-commercial clause, that's a different kind of open license. And in that case, you can recover the cost of printing, but you can't add your profit margin, for example. So I guess what I'm saying is, one, it depends on the license, if it has non-commercial license or not. But even if it has a non-commercial license, recovering the cost of producing the resource is not a commercial activity. You're not profiting off it. So that's absolutely fine. But the other thing we find is this is quite useful for students, of course, when it's affordable print, they buy it. But for the institution as a whole, to be able to provide a service that is affordable for students, that is optional for them, really enhances their teaching and learning. The other piece I will say is faculty, being obviously of an older generation than students generally, even though we certainly have older students as well, they will often sort of talk poetically, romantically almost, about how the smell of paper is very amusing. And that's fine. So pragmatically, I would say, as someone who's sort of building support for this kind of work at my university, setting up the option to have print copies is one of the factors that increases the likelihood that my faculty will adopt open textbooks. So it doesn't matter if 5% or 0% of the students buy it, but if the faculty know that there's the availability of print for those who want it, they're more likely to adopt it. But yeah, in terms of selling a print copy, that's not an issue at all. There've been cases tested in the court system over the last couple of years with, people have been printing, schools or institutions have been printing print copies at, FedEx or print shops, professional print shops, and that's absolutely fine. I mean, what it comes down to is are you respecting the terms of the license? And obviously looking at the commercial, non-commercial aspect, but recovering the cost of printing does not violate the terms of a Creative Commons license.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
I just have one. It's not actually a question, but like you're all talking about this openness and sharing and things. And from a psychological point of view, when you're talking about this evolutionary perspective, like we have a fear of sharing. And where does that come? Because that has to be addressed if you're talking about sharing. And because even our faculty, some of the academics, what they have is like, okay, so what if it gets into the wrong hand? What if it's somebody else's? So this fear of sharing, where we are talking about the resources, the lack of resources, limiting it to yourself. I think like when you're talking about sharing something, that's something where we need to sort of go back and think about. Where
Absolutely.
does that?
So I will say without shame that I fully lean on my psychological training when I'm trying to advance this. So, for example, in social psychology, we talk about the science of persuasion and how there's different kinds of norms. There's one kind of norm which is what we call injunctive norms. And in simple words, that's when we use the word ought. Right? This is what we ought to do. And a lot of the work in open education sounds like ought language, right? We ought to be publishing openly. We ought to be doing science transparently. We ought. But there's another kind of norm, which is what is. And those are descriptive norms. And this is what people are actually doing. And the most powerful persuasion is when those are aligned. Right? So if you say that they're misaligned, and I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit of a tangent over here, but let's say blood donation. Let's say you have a public announcement campaign that says, look, most, 75% of people who are eligible to donate blood in Sri Lanka don't donate blood. Please donate blood. I just made that up, by the way. I have no idea whether that's true or not. And you think that's persuasive, but for most people, they will see that and say, oh my God, I no longer feel guilty about not donating because most people are also not donating. So what you need to do is say ought and is at the same time. So strategically, I would say to get over that fear of sharing, you need to create incentives. So one is you need to say, this is what we ought to be doing, and look, here are 500 people or 50 people or 10 people at my institution right now that I can point to at OUSL who are already doing this work. So normalizing it in the context of your institution is really important to encourage people. Also, you're talking about change, individual change, but I would say organizational change at the same time. You will have people at your institution right now who are doing things that are so innovative, not just without support, but sometimes despite active opposition, they're still innovating because that's what they care about, that's what they're passionate about. So I think recognizing those early adopters, finding them, celebrating them in a very public way, encourages other people to think, oh wow, it's not just that this work is not going to be penalized, it's actually going to be recognized, it's actually going to be celebrated. I want to be celebrated, I want to be recognized. Also, I think the arguments are different. You're not going to get everyone. And I mean, this is a water bottle, but imagine for a moment this is a pencil, right? You've got the sort of lead, which is the leading edge. These are the early adopters, right? These are the people you're going to get. There's people who follow them, who see the work that they're doing, and they, wow, that actually works, so I'm going to follow them. Yes, you've got the erasers at the other side, but forget that. You're always going to have the erasers. That doesn't matter. Most people are in the middle, though. Most people are neither here nor there. They're the wood. And these are the people who would do what you're thinking of if it was easy, if it was supported, if it was incentivized, if it didn't have to go way out of their way to do it. And so I think aligning the institutional incentive structures carefully, along with proper messaging and actual support, is a way to do that. But I think you need to go back to what does the individual really want to achieve. If they want their work to have impact, you can show them how doing this can serve their goals. And so that's why whenever I work with institutions, one of the first things we do is I look at all of the strategic planning documents of the institution. Where's your academic plan? Where's your mission statement? And we'll spend 10 minutes highlighting, okay, what language in this plan for your university for the next 5 years or whatever, you've already agreed upon this as a community. It's been vetted by the government, all of that. What language can I highlight which open education directly benefits that? So I think it's the same for an individual. What does that individual want to achieve? And how can I explain the benefits of open education to the goal that they already want? So I'm not persuading them to do anything different. It's more like, to use a cliche, it's not what you can do for open, it's what open can do for you. And if you can make that argument in the right way, it's great. But I will also say a core value of openness is not just access and all of this stuff, it's also agency. So individual choice, autonomy, I think is incredibly important. So I think one of the worst things one can do for open education is to mandate it, is to sort of say this, everyone has to do this. It destroys an open education movement. So I think if you describe it and frame it that this is more freedom, more academic freedom, these are more choices that you didn't have before, nobody's taking away your previous choices, and then it's just a question of making your choices in a way that allows you to achieve your goals in a more efficient way. So I'd say that's part of it. But you know as well as I do as a psychologist that this is a complicated thing, and you're talking about change management at organizational, individual unit, and individual levels. And in some cases, because of the incentive structures being misaligned, you have individuals who want to do this work, who want to make these changes, but they can't. So I also would say do not assume that people who are not practicing, let's say, open education, don't value open education. They probably do. It just may be a question of some of the systemic barriers that are inhibiting it, for example. But yeah.
Thank you very much for your time and valuable information for our society and also to the university.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I really totally thrilled to be able to visit your university and beautiful country for the first time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this day. Thank you.